All right, we are live, kicking it off right away. A warm welcome. You immediately hear a dog barking, so you can tell that I'm working from home today, as probably many of you. So hopefully that will not continue and the sound will be all clear and good. So a warm welcome to everyone to this live webcast with EU training. It's about EPSO competition for technicians and support workers. So it's one of our usual series of information webcasts where we decode what the details are for this particular competition, whether it differs in any way from others, how does it work in practice, what sort of steps you need to take to get one of these jobs. And then, of course, I'll be more than happy to answer questions that you may have at this very live session, or perhaps later if you watch it as a recording. So with that, I'd like to welcome you, and a bit of housekeeping while I encourage you to put into the chat box our usual challenge, which is not a big challenge. Where are you dialing in from? Where are you listening to this particular broadcast? Which part of the world do we reach you at? That would be great. So put that into the chat box. So this way you will have a good practice to find the chat box for later when you have a specific question that you might want to ask. Here's one. Adolfo is joining us from Spain. What about the others? Belgium, you're probably pretty close to where I am. Helsinki, let's see who is the furthest away. We do this little fun exercise before all the webcasts that we run. Sometimes we reach as far as different parts of Asia, Africa, or even beyond. Italy, any other takers? Anyone else? Greece, very well. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that with us. In the background, invisibly but very much actively participating with us is Lenke and Veronica, who made this webcast happen. They will answer your technical questions or things that may not be about EPSO or connection. Usually, if you have any problem with the connection, then restarting the browser or using a different device will fix it. And you can join us just as well. In extreme case, if you still cannot join, we will be sharing with you everything afterwards. A few words about myself, which you probably have seen my background. I used to work for different EU institutions, and I've been involved with EU training for more than a decade. And you might know the Ultimate EU Test Book, which I co-authored. But going back a little bit to the housekeeping, and in case you missed something, we will be sending you the recording of this very event within a day, and we'll be sending you the presentation slides as well. So everything that you see on the screen will be shared with you. And we also send you the transcript. So if you prefer to read it rather than watch it, you can absolutely do that as well. About us, I'll just spend a couple of seconds before we get to the bottom of today's presentation. So EU training has been a fabulous and very robust community, over 100,000 registered users. Over the many years we've been in business, we have 55,000 followers, fans on Facebook. So do join that community if you are on Facebook. And then we offer really a pretty wide range of test packages. So over 25,000 questions in our database, which I find is a very, very massive amount of questions, and it's growing actually. We are adding new questions to the database whenever there is a knowledge-based multiple choice quiz that EPSO requires, or we need to update certain parts of the database. So that is a growing cohort of questions. And then we have over 17 million questions that have been used by our users, creating test simulations and preparing for the exams. And then a huge number of webinars, webcasts, and information sessions. All of this is available on our website. You can directly get it. Sometimes you need to purchase it, but a large number of these are free. And we have tens of thousands of participants. And just to highlight that there's a special offer coming, we'll be sharing this with you in the very end. So it's a special discount code that you can take advantage of if you stay at the live session, but even beyond, it's going to be valid for 48 hours. So you are more than welcome to peruse that. So with that, let's get into the actual topic of today's discussion, which is the competition and a couple of practical questions around it before we look at the exam process. And as I said before, you are more than welcome to ask questions in the chat box. I'll do my best to answer it at the live session, depending on how many of you will be asking those questions. Usually I manage to cover most, if not all of them, but if that's not the case, we'll follow up. And also, if there's a piece of information I may not have at my disposal right now, I will make sure to look into it. First question, where will you possibly work if, or rather when, you are successful in the competition and you get to the recruitment stage? Now, the place of work usually for most EU officials would be Brussels or Luxembourg. But for this particular competition, it's a little more complicated than that. The idea is that once you are on the reserve list, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So when the selection process that the European Personnel Selection Office, EPSO, administers results in a reserve list. And then you are actually recruited from that reserve list. That is when they decide what the place of employment would be. So it all depends on which European institution will be the one that hires you. And that is decided at the moment of the actual recruitment. So you cannot choose any of these locations when you apply for these competitions, and you do not really know at the moment of your application where you may end up. You certainly have a choice in the end, so you're not going to be obliged to work in one place or another. But obviously, if there's a vacancy and you get a phone call after you are successful in the competition and you are on the reserve list from ISPRA in Italy saying that we would like you to work for us as laboratory support workers as a successful candidate in the EPSO AST-SC 1121, you can decide whether or not you're going to say yes. Certainly, there are lots of pros, perhaps some cons in terms of family relocation, but then they offer you different allowances and offer you different benefits to actually set up your life in those locations. But the bottom line is, this is decided at the moment of recruitment. Depending on which competition you apply for or which profile you apply for, such as audiovisual conference technicians, then chances are it will be Brussels or Luxembourg. If you are a candidate and a successful one at that, for building technicians, again, Brussels or Luxembourg. When it comes to lab technicians, though, then the choice is a bit more diverse. So it could be Geel in Belgium, it could be ISPRA in Italy, Karlsruhe in Germany, and Petten in the Netherlands. And very similarly for lab support workers, the same locations would be on the menu. And again, depending on where a vacancy is and where you might get an invitation from. So these are somewhat different from other competitions, as I said, where typically you would have Brussels and Luxembourg as options. EU institutions are nevertheless all on the menu. So which institution actually hires you? Again, it's decided at the moment of recruitment. So if you're a conference technician, then you could as well work at the Council of the EU, or you could as well work in Luxembourg at the Court of Justice, or you could as well work at the European Economic and Social Committee in Brussels. EPSO, the Personnel Selection Office, their task is to find suitable candidates and place them on the reserve list. But they work for the benefit of all the institutions. So again, EPSO does not run the selection competition for the European Commission only. They do this for all the EU institutions and bodies. Now, I see there is a question from Yolanta. So do you stay on the reserve list if you refuse an offer? How long is the list valid for? Very good question. Yes, you do stay on the reserve list and you can refuse an offer. Now, whether you want to or whether it's a good idea, it's a bit of a gamble sometimes, a bit of a dilemma, whether you can expect or reasonably expect another offer before the reserve list expires. Because the reserve list does expire after a while. It is usually stated on the reserve list how long it's valid for. The general rule of thumb is that the more specialist a competition is, and this one is considered a specialist competition, the reserve list will be valid for more than a year. It might be valid for 2 or 3 years, and typically it's valid until everyone who wants to be hired from that list is actually hired. So if you have, let's say 10% of the candidates are still on the list after 2 years, chances are they do not want to be hired because their life circumstances have changed. But for specialist competitions, it could be valid for 2 years or longer. And if there are still many candidates who are not hired from the list, yet there is need from the institutions to take those as future staff, they might even extend the validity of the reserve list. I see here's a comment from Benjamin. So wondering if they will take in consideration, oops, it got drifted up, consideration those that made it through the last AST-SC 2 for meeting operators. That's actually the same questions with the AV Tech. Well, previous competitions do not apply to new ones, in the sense that whatever exam you've passed, whatever score you got in computer-based tests or the assessment center or talent screener, that does not carry on to subsequent competitions. So once, even if you were successful or you're on the reserve list or you did not succeed, that really has nothing to do with new competitions. Obviously, if you've practiced a lot for those competitions, the knowledge stays in you, hopefully, and that's something you can apply for new ones. But from a procedural perspective, this does not carry on. All right, let's go to the next one. And as I said before, decided the moment of recruitment, perhaps you are more interested in how to get started and how to enroll in these competitions. And then we can talk about the different tests and what you can do to maximize your score. So positions available, that's something you would most likely be fully aware of because it's written in the notice of competition. We already know that for the AST-3 angle or the AST-3 part of this competition package, you have the 3 profiles. So for the technicians competition, 3 profiles. So audiovisual and conference technicians, there are 92 places on the reserve list. For building technicians, 114, and for lab technicians, 20 places. So that's a pretty good number compared to other competitions and compared to how many people are typically selected in any given competition. These numbers look good. So that means you will have much more chances of being the one on the reserve list, obviously with the caveat that it all depends on how many candidates apply, because if you only have 200 laboratory technicians applicants and 20 places, well, it's the chances are 1 in 10. But for audiovisual, if you have 2,000, then despite being a much higher number, 92 places on the reserve list, yet the proportions are vastly different. So it all depends on the number of candidates, and yet, given these numbers, I think the chances are, by and large, pretty good. It's not that there's an extremely limited number of places and you need to be the 1% of the 1% best performing candidates. So this is the technicians competition, AST-3. And then you have the lab support workers. So that is a different grade. It's a different level in the EU's hierarchy and pay grade. So it's AST-SC 1. So AST refers to assistant level. SC is secretary 1. Obviously, this is not a secretary position, but this is the in terms of salary and official sort of ranking, that's the level at which they want to hire. So there are 15 places there. I think there is a mistake in our slide because here we, no, excuse me, I confused it for a second. There are no mistake in the slide. The numbers are accurate. So for the lab technicians, it's 15. In terms of deadline, you have the 26th of October as deadline, so pretty much a month from now. Make sure that you don't leave your application to the last moment. Often candidates may not get to finalizing their application or pressing all the right buttons and ticking all the boxes and filling all the fields that are necessary. Maybe a day or two before is the way to go. You just don't want to risk that you might run out of the deadline. Make sure that by the 26th, everything is done and everything is sent to EPSO through their website. The most important question tends to be whether or not you are considered eligible for the competition. And there are some general and there are some specific requirements that you need to meet. The general conditions are typically not hard to meet. So you must have EU citizenship, which presumably all of you have. You must have completed military service, if that's compulsory in your country. And you need to meet the character requirements of the job. So that's not a very high bar to jump over. What could be more complicated, and we'll look at it in a moment after the language rules, are some specific background achievements or certain professional qualifications that you need to have in order to be eligible. Before we look at those, there are also the language rules. So language rules are just following the playbook EPSO has been using for many years now. So first you choose a so-called language 1. Language 1 is any of the EU's 24 official languages. I usually say it's not necessarily your mother tongue, because you may have grown up speaking Russian or speaking Luxembourgish, which are neither of which is EU official language. You need to choose from one of the 24, and it could be really anything. It doesn't matter whether it's truly your mother tongue or you've just learned it to such, and you speak it at such level that it's almost like mother tongue. So you're completely fluent, you can express yourself perfectly, you can read and write in that language perfectly. So it can be any of the 24 and really independently of the passport you might carry. Language 2, on the other hand, has to be English or French. And again, you're free to choose either of the two, and it needs to be different from the first language. So me, despite being Hungarian and having Hungarian as my mother tongue, I could choose English as my language 1, and I could choose French as language 2, but I just as well could choose Hungarian as language 1 and then French as language 2. So it's entirely up to you. There's a bit of best practice that might go into your decision, where for language 1, I encourage you to choose a language in which you can process information the fastest, somewhat passively. So reading and writing, you can do it relatively quickly or relatively fast in language 1. And language 2 would be a language in which you can actively express yourself the best. So in spoken language, in written language, that's where in which you can really express your thoughts with the greatest sophistication and accuracy. So if you have the luxury, the liberty to choose from many languages because you're a polyglot, then try to consider this logic and then choose the language accordingly. Once you've done that, comes the real hard part, or perhaps the more challenging part to some candidates, because everyone's life and professional experience is just so different, and you need to be able to demonstrate the existence of a certain professional experience or education in case that is requested, and it will be requested at one point. What are these qualifications? So let's look at it. For audiovisual and conference technicians, so the field 1 within the AST-3 competition, you have two choices. One is that you either have a post-secondary education that you got a degree in and 3 years professional experience relevant to the duties. So you have usually perhaps either a master's or some other formal accredited education attested by some formal qualification degree of sorts. where you learned to master your trade, and you have 3 years relevant professional experience. So that's option one. You could have a high school degree, essentially secondary education, which would qualify you to apply for university, but you do not need any further education there. So you simply have a high school degree, and you have 6 years of relevant work experience related to the field. So you don't necessarily need to have formal qualification to be applied for the job. You need to have a high school degree, a baccalaureate, essentially, and you need to have at least 6 years of experience. Or if you have professional qualifications, then it's 3 + 3. What about building technicians? The principles are very similar. Perhaps what slightly differs is the kind of topics, the kind of things that your post-secondary education covers. So that's a question of what sort of course or formal education you followed after your high school degree, and does that qualify? Does that make you a relevant and suitable candidate for this competition? So there, the question is what you studied, and here's a list, as you can read on the screen. So building security and building technology, energy environment management, and others. And then again, you have the other option where you do not have any formal qualification in this particular field. You have a high school degree, but then again, you have 6 years of relevant work experience. To this logic, very similar for lab technicians. So again, post-secondary education related to the field, plus 3 years of relevant professional experience, or high school degree, and then 6 years of professional experience. So this is pretty straightforward in most cases, though the relevant experience can cause some challenge to some candidates. So what is truly a relevant experience? It refers to the annex of the notice of competition. So you could say, well, I did this, I did that, my job was quite related to this part or that part, and does that qualify? All right, so do you think that as an architect, I'm eligible for field 2? On the face of it, I presume yes, or civil engineer or architect. So again, without digging deeper and with the legal disclaimer that I am not the selection board that will make those judgment calls, it sounds like you could be. And then for lab support workers. So for lab support workers, again, you have here 3 scenarios where it says post-secondary education of at least 1 year. So this is after high school, you have a relevant minimum 1 year course or certification that you followed. Another option is that you have basically a high school degree, but then you have 3 years of experience. Or you have professional training of minimum 1 year. So it's a professional training of minimum 1 year plus a minimum of 3 years professional experience. So you see that this is a mix and match of degree, qualification, and experience. And again, depending on your background, you really need to check to what degree do you fulfill these criteria. A computer scientist can be considered eligible. Yeah, I would not want to answer that. So it's hard to tell. It really depends on which profile you want to apply for, to what degree is that relevant to the kind of tasks that are required in the job. And as I said, it can often be a difficult thing to decide. If you are somewhat uncertain, but there are some good persuasive arguments why you qualify, I would encourage you to do so, because the selection board will check all the supporting documents and then they will decide on your case. So do not immediately disqualify yourself if you think you're rather in the gray zone. Obviously, if you have a non-relevant experience, or non-relevant degree or qualification, that's a different case. So hopefully that gives you some clarity, and for most of you, this is a clear-cut thing, that you have the right profile, the right experience, and you do enter into one of these categories. And then comes perhaps the least difficult thing, why this is a great opportunity. Well, you probably would not be listening to this call or being interested in this opportunity were it not for the great opportunity it is. Salaries are often very attractive. Certainly depends on which part of Europe you might be coming from. So in relative terms, how attractive that is. But still, even in local Belgian or Dutch or Italian and other opportunities, this tends to be very attractive salaries. Good news is on EU training, we have a salary calculator. It gives you a very close estimation to how much you could potentially earn. So you would enter all the relevant data about your family status or where you are relocating from if you need relocation, and then it will give you the level of position like AST3 or AST-SC 1, and then it will give you a rough estimation of how much your salary could possibly be. And apart from that, you have good benefits, health insurance, European school, if you have children, and the health insurance I mentioned. So overall, it's pretty interesting. And of course, you're working in an international environment and in interesting European Union related topics and projects. So that is also a great motivational factor for most candidates to work in these jobs. Here comes the question: how do you get these jobs? So that's something I'd like to cover in the next couple of minutes, or more than a couple of minutes, because I'll be sharing with you the kind of exams you need to go through and then some ideas how you can make the most of those. So the application process, the very first step is that you need to declare your eligibility based on all the criteria that we've covered so far. You pick the languages, language 1 and language 2, based on the logic, or presumably based on the logic I have suggested. And then you can submit your application in any of the 24 languages. So you could be submitting your application in Romanian, even if that's not the language 1 or 2 that you picked. This is all for the transparency and openness of the selection process. And then comes at one point, we'll get to it in a moment, a so-called talent screener. So the talent screener needs to be filled out in French or English. So it cannot be in any of the 24 languages, but that needs to be French or English. And as we said before, validate the application before the 26th of October. So a few words about the talent screener. Let me take a quick sip of tea so I gather my mental strength. And I can describe what a talent screener is and how you can make the most of it. You might be also asking, is it a talent screener or how is it being scored? Well, it's scored in a way that every question tends to have a score value from 0 to 3. So that is how most often it's being scored. Again, with the caveat that in this competition might be different, but the logic will certainly remain the same. And then depending on how many points you get for each of the answers you gave, they add up. And then in the end, there's a cutoff point that you need to get, and they score candidates accordingly and then rank candidates accordingly. So the question then becomes, how do you maximize your points in the talent screener so you can make the most of it and improve or increase your chances the best you can? So here are a couple of tips. Well, whatever they ask, as long as you are being truthful, as long as you are really honest and there's no distortion of the facts and your background information, try to answer yes to as many questions as you can. Why? Because obviously if you say no, that's a 0 point, but if with yes, you might be able to come up with arguments and bits and pieces that will yield a point or two. You probably want to provide a lot of valuable information. So they would ask you about your professional background, your experience of working with certain tools or working on certain projects. They want to know that you are a relevant, high-profile candidate that they should pass to the next stage and ultimately get into the institutions. So you want to provide a lot of valuable, tangible, practical pieces of information, and do not talk about very vague concepts, to say I was extremely motivated to work on a project because it gave me such insight into scientific discovery. Fantastic, but you just said nothing. So say about, I worked on building automation for 12 months, and the project had a budget of 65,000 euros, and it was a research into energy efficiency for old buildings. Yeah, so you want to put numbers, you want to put figures, you want to be very concrete instead of just saying high level stuff. So try to add very specific pieces of information, as I said, budgets, timeframes, levels of responsibility, how many people you worked with, make it very concrete. And if some questions may resemble others in your talent screener, still, I advise you not to copy paste your answers, or you copy paste it as a draft, but then you customize it, you fine tune it in a way that it will be still a unique answer. So even if the question resembles a previous one and you could pretty much give the same information, still, I encourage you to make it more relevant, customize it. You might want to leave out certain parts or emphasize others because the question is still unique and you want to give unique answers. A couple of other tips. This is more about the presentation, the way you write those answers, that you want to be able to present information that's easy for the assessors, the people reading the talent screener and giving the score, to make it easy for them to understand it, and then turn your written words into points. So you want to be structured, you want to have clear references, you could use bullet points. Even if there is no bolding and underlining, you can nicely cut the paragraphs and lay it out in a way that's easy to visually scan and get the most important information from it. And then also think about what's in it for them. So why does your experience working on building automation in Estonia, how could that be relevant for European institutions? So take a look at the website of the Joint Research Center. Take a look at the website of the Building Management Department of the European Commission. Take a look, or Real Estate Management even. Take a look at the website of how conferences and audiovisual technology is being handled inside the European Parliament or the European Commission. So you can Google it, you can find those, get a bit of sense of how they do it right now. And then you can connect your past experience with the kind of profile, the kind of business needs of European institutions, so you make a better case why your experience is truly relevant for them. And this you can express nicely in words inside the talent screener that you submit. So also keep in mind that institutions tend to be fairly formal, so they like their own terminology, and you can find those on those websites. You can find those in annual reports where they talk about how they managed conferencing and online and web streaming in the past year. So you find their own lingo, which is large part always industry specific, and you probably are aware of your industry jargon, but it's also European institution specific. So by adopting a similar choice of words, you can increase their impression, or you can get them to have a better impression that you are a relevant candidate. And then finally, if you are interested in more tips and more ideas, I actually have a webinar exactly on the talent screener that you might want to look into, which is called Everything You Need to Know About EPSO's Talent Screener. And that's a recording. It's available on our website, something you can check out. I believe it's a paid webinar, but again, the discount code we'll be sharing will be applicable for that as well. Step 2 is the computer-based test, so the abstract verbal numerical reasoning tests, which are classic, and many of you would likely be familiar with them. Still, just to make sure everyone is on the same page, I'll describe them in some words. Now, the very important question here is, when are you required to sit this test? When do you need to take the abstract verbal numerical reasoning test? And the answer to that is there are two options. So we don't know yet where in the process this is going to sit. The first option is that there are a lot of candidates. And a lot is hard to define, but they usually look at as a benchmark maybe 10 times more than the number of places on the reserve list. So if there's a great big interest in some of the profiles, then the selection board can decide, okay, we need to, or we want to do a computer-based test. That will then become sort of a selection test at that stage. But if there aren't so many candidates, so perhaps not 10 times, but just 6 or 7 times more candidates than the number of places on the reserve list, then the computer-based test, the abstract verbal numerical reasoning, will be part of the assessment center. So then it will be part of a larger package, but that's already one step ahead because then it doesn't become eliminatory. So you see that if there are a lot of people interested, then they say, okay, let's build in this safety valve where we get those candidates to sit those computer-based tests, and then we can filter them and we have fewer people to deal with. Whereas if there aren't so many candidates, then say, okay, this will be part of the overall score, and it's not eliminatory yet. It's an important part, but it will be one of the many tests that they will need to sit. Verbal reasoning questions, and again, I presume this is not new to the majority of those watching or listening to this session yet. So it's about having 20 questions and 35 minutes, where you have a text passage, you have a question, you have 4 statements, and you need to pick the one that's the most accurate. And then it's a logical test, so it's not about reading comprehension, but you need to think about it. Whether what's written there, is it possibility or fact? Is it about similar wording? What is the logic? And then you find the correct answer. Then you have numerical reasoning, 10 questions you need to answer in 20 minutes. Very similar. It's a thinking exercise, a logic exercise, where you need to have calculate, estimate, guesstimate, and then find the correct answer. Whenever it's possible, do not use the calculator. Try to estimate. It's always faster. But you do have a calculator, so you don't need to count in your head. But again, it takes a bit of extra time if you tap on the virtual or physical keyboard and try to find the correct answer. Abstract reasoning, 10 questions in 10 minutes. This tends to be the most difficult for most candidates. But then again, everyone has this right brain, left brain kind of thinking. Where are you stronger? And for some people, this is really easy. But this is about finding the next pattern in a sequence. Now, the scoring is the way EPSO has been doing for some time for most competitions. They separate the verbal reasoning so that you truly need to pass with at least 50%, whereas the numerical and abstract reasoning is combined. So you only need to have 50% of the combined score. So you can have 0 point in numerical reasoning and 10 points in abstract, and you would still pass. If this is used as a pre-selection test, because there are many candidates, so remember that was our scenario 1, you probably need higher scores, because then the ranking among candidates will be based on the score. If the CBT is part of the assessment center, your scores needn't be that high, because you can actually get more points by performing well in other parts of the assessment center. So that's where it becomes more important, which part of the process is this being used, because that determines how well you need to perform on these tests. Now, the good news is on EU training, we have thousands or tens of thousands of abstract verbal numerical reasoning tests, which we're continuously revising, improving, adding, updating. And we actually have the verbal reasoning tests in all 24 languages of the EU. So no matter which language you choose for the competition, you can practice verbal reasoning in any of the 24 official EU languages. Only then comes the talent screener review. So those who got the higher scores, their talent screener will be reviewed. and scored according to the logic I described. Then comes the fun, the assessment center. So the assessment center, the number of candidates invited to the assessment center is roughly 3 times that of the number of places on the reserve list. So depending on which competition, which profile you applied for, you have a 1 to 3 chance, or 3 times the number of places there to be among those candidates. And then you are invited to the assessment center to sit through certain tests. By the way, one very important piece of information I forgot to mention: when it comes to the AST-3 competition, you can only choose one profile. You cannot go for the building technicians and conference and audiovisual part. You need to choose one from the 3 profiles. So going on, assessment center, it's run in your language too, meaning either English or French. And the location is either online or in person. Now, it used to be entirely in person, then the pandemic hit, and now it's slowly planned to be coming back. I think that's the right way of putting it. But assessment center still often or predominantly happens online. So there are online tools that they have developed. There are 7 general competencies that are being tested in the assessment center. And then there is another part where they test what you know about your particular subject matter. But the general competencies, it's about what sort of skills, what sort of competencies you as an individual employee, I mean, as individual as such, what you have. These are tested through different kinds of exams. And from those exams, they kind of decode, take the information, how you how you score on a given competence. So these 7 are basically evaluated through 2 tests. One is the case study exam, and the other one is the so-called SCBI, so the situational competency-based interview. These are, again, pretty classic. We have lots of case studies on our website. You can do simulation, and you can even ask for personalized feedback. And then we have the SCBI, where our coaches and trainers run courses both in person in Brussels. So we've restarted with the in-person trainings, and online they can have one-on-one and even group sessions if you're interested, though for the situational competency-based interview, one-on-one is perhaps the most effective format. And then you have a field-related interview. So field-related interview means an interview about your particular subject matter, about your particular chosen issue or chosen area. And there they would test in the format, in an interview, how your expert knowledge compares to others and how well you know your stuff. Where do you prepare for this is a common question. Well, certainly you want to revise sort of core information, or if there's a textbook related to your field, you definitely revise as many of those as possible, so you are truly knowledgeable about different aspects of your work. And then to my earlier point, you probably want to revise or look up some resources on EU institutions' websites. And if it's about conference technology or conference technicians, you probably want to look at the European Parliament and the European Commission and the Economic and Social Committee and Committee of Regions, where they tend to have an enormous amount of, run an enormous number of events. So they certainly have some materials online linked to those, or the kind of technology they use, or the kind of challenges they might be facing. So you can certainly do a bit of research online just to get familiar with the kind of challenges, the kind of projects that they work with. So you have more indication as to or more ideas as to the kind of questions you can expect in the field-related interview. And then the scoring, you can see that there's a pretty big difference between the relative weight of your general competencies and your expert knowledge. So the general competencies are worth overall 70 points because 7 competencies, each having 10 points. And then you have the field-rated interview, which is 100 points if you are the perfect expert in that field, and minimum 50 points need to be reached. And then those who get the highest overall scores, they will be placed on the reserve list. So this is where it's truly a competition. So you don't only need to pass the 50% pass mark, but more importantly, you need to be ranked well compared to other candidates. And then when you're on the reserve list, we spoke about the number of places, the validity, and then comes the actual recruitment. Now, how to get a job from the reserve list, we have a couple of tips, and also there's a dedicated webinar for that if you're ever interested, called How to Get a Job Once You Are on the Reserve List. So hopefully you'll get there fairly soon, though you might ask how long this whole process takes. Chances are 6 to 9 months, which is rather long, I understand that, yet much shorter than it used to be. But it takes some time until they go through all the hoops of the process. Our advice, practice consistently for several weeks. And I often compare it to sports competitions where you just cannot shape up or get in shape 2 weeks before an important physical challenge. This is more of a mental challenge, but you do need some time to practice and get in the mood of numerical reasoning, read up on your professional experience, and perhaps get some group coaching or in-person training when it comes to the assessment center. Prepare consistently, whether it's 1 hour per day or 10 hours per week, as long as it's consistent and regular. Again, similarly to a sports preparation, you just cannot do that once a week and expect good results. Very important, there's methodology. So we have an enormous number of ebooks on our website. All of them are free, or almost all of them are free, and you can download them. There's a lot of advice there of the shortcuts, the methods, the ways to find the answers to difficult problems. You can learn the methodology. So being persistent is really important. And obviously, we suggest that you would do a lot of simulations, because the more you practice, the better you will get. So we're here really to help you. And yeah, so Asha says, EPSO said 11 months as a fast track competition. Oof, yeah, well, so my 6 to 9 months is perhaps more optimistic based on the rumors and indications I hear from EPSO where they are trying to speed it up. But yes, perhaps I should be more realistic to set your expectations and say less than a year. So with that, with the website obviously is available for you. Our team is there to help you. So feel free to ask questions, send messages through the support team or through our Facebook page or any other channel you find us on. We're happy to help. This obviously has no cost, and we give you information or try to point you to the right direction. And then we have the simulated test, the one I mentioned, the verbal reasoning, something we're really, really proud of, that we have questions in 24 languages. And then numerical abstract reasoning, also case study simulations and the workshops. The webinars, the beginner's guides and the pro tips. And there's even a math refresher for numerical reasoning. So if you haven't dealt with numerical reasoning or anything similar to that, you might want to check those out with all the other resources we have available. So there are EPSO communities as well, different groups that you might want to join, dedicated to these particular competitions. And my books, the Ultimate EU Test book, the 2020 edition is applicable, or perhaps the AST version is even more applicable. So there's one assistant. And then the assessment center when you get to that stage as well. So I leave up on the screen the special discount that I highly recommend to check out. You can share it with others. There's no limitation as to how many people can use it, but there's a time limitation that you need to use this code within the next 48 hours. So let me take a quick look. There are a couple of questions that came in I may have missed. So here's one. Could I apply for both competitions, the AST and the AST-SC? And the answer is yes. So those are two separate competitions with their own codes. So those you can apply for both. Obviously, you need to qualify for those in terms of your education or professional experience. But if you think that you have the right experience or qualifications, there is no limitation about the application. The limitation only applies for the one for the AST, where you have different profiles. There you need to pick one profile, excuse me, one profile out of the three. All right. Do you think that if you mention a master's degree or PhD, you could be considered an overqualified in this technical competition? Well, it's a difficult thing. What comes to mind is that you may not be considered overqualified, or they may not even formally care that you're overqualified in the selection part. So when you're applying and you put in what education you have, and you say, well, I went all the way up to PhD in this particular field, they say, well, you know, they might think that you're overqualified, but in procedural terms, what they are allowed to look at is, do you have the minimum qualification? They're not going to say, do you have a maximum qualification? Are you overqualified? So as long as you meet the minimum criteria, that's it. You qualify for the competition. And once the selection process is over and comes the recruitment, that's where it might cause problems. When somebody who may not even have a PhD says, well, I want to have a lab technician who will be working under me on technical tasks, and am I going to hire someone who's got a PhD in this particular field? And they might have second thoughts there. So that's why I'm saying it's in formal procedural terms, it should not cause a problem. In practical recruitment terms, it might. But then again, are you going to deny having a PhD? It's rather a question for yourself, perhaps, to ask yourself and say, would I want to work in this particular job where I know or I consider myself vastly overqualified for this task? So again, it's more of a personal choice. Whether, imagine yourself in that situation where you do get an offer and you need to say yes or no. Would you want to go ahead with it? All right, here's another one. The level of difficulty in the CBT test will be the same as AD5. Typically, no. Typically, they do distinguish between the level of difficulty for AST, so for assistant 3 level, and administrators, so the so-called AD5 level. So chances are that it will be somewhat easier, that given that it's an AST competition. All right, I don't see any other questions at this point. Here, was said on EPSO expert network meeting yesterday, the 11 months. Okay, well, okay, so that's about the duration of the competition. That's helpful information. Thank you for sharing that. All right, here's a question from Yolanta. Situational judgment test, is it part of the assessment center? And the answer is no. It's no longer part of the assessment center. It used to be, but not anymore. So those who ever even heard of the situational judgment test need not worry. This is not part of the assessment center any longer. Any other questions? We have a few minutes left. Then feel free to ask those if they are of common interest. And as I said before, if you are interested in follow-up questions or something comes to mind that you're wondering about, feel free to ask us in any shape or form. We'll be happy to follow up, happy to answer. And perhaps if there are no questions, then we will end the session here. And thank you wholeheartedly for participating. Thank you very much for being here. Do share all these resources and information we put out there. They are for the common good. And you might be wondering, should I increase the number of my competitors? But if you have some friends or colleagues who you think would be interested, then you're welcome to pass it on to them. So with that, thank you so much for dialing in from the four corners of Europe and perhaps even beyond, or watching the recording when it comes to that. And I wish you a lot of success for these competitions. These are great opportunities for those in the field, and a lot of places on the reserve list that gives a good indication of the great need the institutions have. So once the competition concludes, chances are you'll be hired quite fast. So with that, thank you so much to Lenka and Veronica for making this happen and for putting it all together. And I also thank my sweet dog for not barking further. So all good, very good. Have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.